So yeah, like Miguel said, feel free to interrupt when you have questions. I always feel like the best time to ask a question is right when it pops into your head, so you don't forget about it. And then it's going to be the most relevant for anyone else listening in, as we can work through that question right when we're talking about that discussion. But today, what we're going to give is kind of a broad overview of the prioritized target and measure application. What is it? Why did it come about? How is it used? What data comes out of this tool, and how has it been used in Hawaii and elsewhere throughout the country? So I'll begin by saying that this water quality tool that we've been using in Hawaii and Oʻahu is it's been a lot of research and development and updating and upgrading this tool to where it is today. And I'll give a little brief history about why we created this prioritized target and measure application, or PTMApp as we call it. But start with just a general outline of what we're going to discuss today. So again, I'll give a brief history of the tool, nothing too in depth. But then Derek and I will talk about preparing input data, the GIS data that goes into the tool, and how we quality control the inputs and outputs as we're running through the toolbar, because this is a fairly intensive GIS-based tool that has a series of steps in it, and we want to make sure that the outputs of that tool align with the realities of the real world. And then we'll discuss a little more in depth into some of the use and application of the PTMApp data. So the results that we get out, this PTMApp produces a tremendous amount of really useful data, and it can allow you to analyze the landscape in a number of different ways. And I think we'll wrap it up by talking about the future needs of PTMApp on Oahu and elsewhere, and kind of the direction that we could be taking this tool to more widely utilize it on the islands of Hawaii and beyond. So the initial drivers for the creation of this tool is based in legislation that was passed in Minnesota in 2008. It was on the ballot during the voting year in 2008. There was a Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment that the voters of Minnesota voted on and passed, which generated millions of dollars of additional funding, some of which would be allocated towards clean water projects. Along with that state funding, this is funding that's available to watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts, to implement water quality projects. Along with that, there was a Clean Water Accountability Act that was created for making sure that those dollars were going towards management practices and conservation practices that were prioritized, targeted, and there was some sort of measurable water quality benefit that could be taken. So we look to create a tool that would allow us to do that, to prioritize, target, and measure those best management practices as part of that Accountability Act within Minnesota. So the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources funded a project to take some existing water quality models that were available throughout the state and integrate them together, along with a large amount of additional GIS data that was being generated throughout the state of Minnesota and the upper Midwest. And the culmination of all of that was what we call PTMApp, the Prioritized Target and Measure Application. So PTMApp is a GIS mapping analysis process that when it was created, we wanted to make sure it was a publicly available tool, so you didn't have to pay for it, something that was going to be maintained indefinitely, so that it was always there and work and function properly, something that was a tool that was scalable, so something you could use and pull data from on the small scale, so individual farm fields, all the way up to massive watersheds that are thousands of square miles up in this part of the country. We needed a tool that could assess sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen loading at those multiple scales. So if we want to get really nitty gritty, you can analyze sediment loading, for instance, at a farm field scale, or at the scale of the outlet of a watershed that you're analyzing. The tool also needed to be able to determine feasible locations for best management and conservation practices. So that's another thing that this PTMApp tool can do. It can find feasible locations on the landscape for placing one of 24 different kinds of commonly used best management practices. So to do that, we'll talk a little bit more. It uses NRCS design criteria for citing those specific BMPs where they should be on the landscape. And then moving beyond that, once we've got these BMPs located on the landscape, we want to know what the water quality benefit of those could be. So the tool analyzes that sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen loading that's being delivered to a BMP to figure out how much of an effect that BMP could have on reducing at either field edge or downstream nutrients and sediment. And then you get one step beyond that even further. There's a cost analysis in the tool that estimates how much it would cost to implement each of those individual BMPs, so you can get kind of a return on your investment. If we're spending this many dollars implementing this BMP and it's reducing this much sediment or nutrients, what's that return on investment? And you can use that to help you prioritize where you want to invest your money. So the tool is broken up into multiple modules. Each of them does a different piece of what we just discussed. So you get sediment and nutrient source analysis. There's a hydrologic volume and mass routing process in the tool. There's that BMP citing portion of the tool, and then estimating those water quality benefits of the BMPs, and then the cost analysis function. All of those are different modules in this tool that you can kind of step through one after the other as you're utilizing the existing input data and then generating new output data. So I think we'll move on now into talking about what are those input data that go into this PTMApp tool, because it is there's a lot that goes into it, and there's even more that comes out of the tool. But I think, again, as with most models that are environmental models, ensuring that you've got really good input data is very, very important. So that's one of the more time-consuming portions of running PTMApp, is actually just generating that input data that goes into the model. Once you've got that, it's pretty easy just to push some buttons and check the outputs. And I think Derek and I are going to kind of split up between these next few slides a little bit of the explanation, because for our project on Oʻahu, Derek did most of the input data generation and quality control of the inputs and outputs. So we'll kind of flip back and forth between the two of us. But like I just mentioned, the input data is creating that. You can see this table on the right side of the screen. Those are all individual data layers or data tables that need to go into the PTMApp tool to then run appropriately. And this is one of the more significant human time commitments for running the tool, is just creating these. So it requires locating all these individual data layers, which can be difficult for large watersheds with many stakeholders. It can be difficult for different parts of the country where common data that's available in one part of the country might not be common in another part of the country. And then taking all that data and making sure it's formatted properly. It has to go into this GIS-based tool. So this tool runs through ESRI's ArcGIS Pro, and there are certain requirements for how that data has to be formatted to work properly in the tool. So creating all these data layers is pretty time consuming, and you want to make sure you do it right, because if you put good stuff into the tool, you'll get good stuff out of the tool. And if you don't put good stuff into the tool, what's going to come out of the end of the tool. Your data is not going to make a whole lot of sense. So just briefly, again, talking about each of these groups of layers that go into the PTMApp as an input. You've got Surgo soil data. So that's information about soil types and soil characteristics. And there's 4 different Surgo soil layers that are needed for PTMApp that all give different information about the soil and landscape within the different parts of the watershed. And the Surgo data is primarily used for citing BMPs. So part of that NRCS design criteria that says whether or not a BMP is feasible in a specific location or not. It's also used in generating what's called the curve number layer. So curve number layer gives you an estimate of land surface water runoff potential. So if it rains in an area, how much of that rain actually turns into runoff versus gets infiltrated into the ground. So that's used in some of the runoff and volume calculations in PTMApp. And then there's a series of revised universal soil loss equation, or Russell layers. Those again look at land surface and soil characteristics, not so much this time to estimate volume of water runoff, but to estimate how much sediment is being generated in a location in the watershed that can then potentially move downstream and become a pollutant in our receiving water bodies. There's also travel time data layers. So this is PTMApp operates on what's called a raster cell analysis. So you take a watershed like we're seeing down in the lower left-hand corner, and you are just breaking it up into what would be equivalent to little pixels. And each pixel has its own data associated with that. So the travel time layer looks at how long does it take water to move from one of those pixels or cells to the next neighboring cell. And that's going to help us calculate a lot of things like, water volume flowing, mass flow, and decay. And we'll talk about what sediment and nutrient decay is, because PTMApp analyzes sediment and nutrient loading on an annual basis, but not all sediment, for example, that's dislodged in a field and moved downstream actually makes it to the outlet of the watershed on an annual basis. And some of that is travel time dependent. So how long is that piece of sediment moving along? The longer it has to move along, the more likelihood that it will resettle in the stream bank. So that's all based on travel time. With that travel time information, we also can calculate upstream and downstream total travel time of water moving from one portion of the watershed into another. And that's again used in volume and mass routing and decay of the water and of the things that are traveling with the water. Some other general inputs are, well, the watershed boundary. Where do we want to analyze? We define that watershed boundary, and that's where PTMApp will perform all the analyses. A very important layer, and this is something that Derek can probably speak to, are what are called priority resource points. So these are specific data to PTMApp. And what a priority resource point is a location in the watershed that is at a resource of interest, whether it be a reservoir or an impaired water body or a water body of interest. If we put a priority resource point at that location in the watershed, it's a location where PTMApp will summarize a lot of the data that it's generating. So we can get things like total loading of sediment to that priority resource point, whether it be the inlet of a lake or the outlet of the watershed. Let's say you've got a fragile habitat just offshore of your watershed, and you want to know how much sediment is coming from the watershed to that point and leaving the watershed, which could potentially endanger that habitat. If you put a priority resource point at the outlet of the watershed, you'll know, based on the estimates from PTMApp, how much sediment is moving downstream that could move into that habitat. It also lets you know, if you perform a bunch of upstream best management and conservation practices, how much sediment or nutrients you can prevent from leaving the watershed because of those upstream actions that you have accomplished. So that's what a priority resource point is. It's just a location in the watershed that you can use and analyze a lot of the data that's being generated from PTMApp. And I know, Derek, you can probably speak to this. You probably we're talking with individuals in the watershed and people from RC&D about where to put those priority resource points, because you can put them wherever you want in the watershed. It's based on where local priorities are and where those water bodies of interest are. I don't know, Derek, did you do much with going around and talking to people and kind of adjusting and adding and moving around those priority resource points?
Yeah, so for the two watersheds that we piloted this on, each of those, we identified priority resource points in a couple ways. So firstly, we place them places where there are data points, so like stream gauges, so we can use that as our kind of quality control spots. But then also, yeah, getting feedback from um, landowners, land managers, resource managers within these watersheds, to identify places of their personal interest or places that they're aware of that we should be monitoring, significant areas where sediment might be collecting from different areas. Obviously, the coastline is an obvious place to place them, but then, yeah, various locations as the water makes its way downstream. And the priority resource points, like we've done a couple iterations of them. They're not hard to add more. And so, yeah, it's kind of just an iterative process as we find more people who are interested in the info and want to collaborate. We can always add more points there and get that summarized data pretty easily.
Yep. So that priority resource point data that goes into PTMApp it's all local based information that you decide where you want the PTMApp data to be summarized, and you can add as many of those priority resource points as you want to get summarized data at anywhere in the watershed. Now, I think what I always consider to be one of the most important inputs to PTMApp is what's called a hydro-conditioned digital elevation model. So a digital elevation model is just your elevation, your latitude, no, not latitude and longitude, your altitude, your height layer. And you can get a raw digital elevation model, which is just like your satellite LiDAR data. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that if we've got this DEM and we put it into the PTMAP model, that it's going to accurately represent water flowing across the landscape. So if we take water and we put it onto this digital elevation model, we want to make sure that in the model, water is flowing appropriately where it should actually flow, because a raw digital elevation model doesn't know the location of ditches and culverts necessarily. So if there's a culvert that goes under a road, well, the raw unconditioned DEM won't necessarily know that there's a culvert there, and that'll act as a dam and it'll prevent water from flowing. So I know Derek spent a significant amount of time going through and making sure that this digital elevation model that PTMApp needed had information about where those culverts were, so we could make sure that we told the model, yes, I know it looks like there's a something that's going to prevent water flowing there, but we need to make sure that water can flow because in reality there's a culvert there. And that's going to be really important for how the tool models locations of best management practices and accurately represents where water is accumulating and flowing. So here's an example of how you hydro condition a digital elevation model. You can see these two images. And here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but on the image on the left, there's a culvert that's under this road. You can see an elevated surface there where there's the arrow that says flow path is blocked. That means that according to how the model is going to read the data, it's not going to allow water flowing there because it looks like it's blocked. Well, Derek would go out and say, okay, there's actually a culvert there. So he would come back into the digital elevation model, and we see on the right, we've got an example of what we would do to that digital elevation model. We put in what's called a burn line, which essentially just artificially lowers the elevation at that point, allowing water to flow through just like it does in real life. So there's a culvert there, water flows through the culvert. In the hydrologically conditioned digital elevation model, we lower that elevation at that one location to make sure that the modeled water in the PTMAP tool can flow as it does in the real life. So we're just trying to align our model data with real world conditions. That's what hydro conditioning does. And that again makes our input data for PTMAP much more accurate, which then allows our outputs to be more accurate and more accurately represent what's actually happening in the real world. So Derek, I think there's a few slides here where you kind of go in to a little bit more detail about the iterative process that you went through of hydro conditioning the watersheds that we've piloted.
Yep. Yeah, Cool. So thanks for all the explanation, Scott. So yeah, so at this point, we're still on the creating the input layers for PTMApp. So we haven't actually run the tool yet, but like Scott said, this is a step that I've spent a significant amount of time on the computer and on the field, on the ground, actually at site, to get this part right. And I'd say this is probably the main reason why we can't just go ahead and apply this tool to the whole island or the whole state. This step of conditioning the DEM to make it a hydro DEM is probably the number one step that takes a lot of site-specific time and effort to get it right. And so, yeah, so I'm going to show you some examples here from the Kayaka Bay watershed. This was the first site that we piloted this tool on. So we approach doing the hydrologically conditioned DEM by first starting with what data is available. So the raw DEM that Scott was referring to. In Hawaii, we have pretty good publicly available DEM. It's a 1 meter resolution. And so that's pretty comparable to like the high resolution products that they have for the mainland. So first of all, this is a great tool to use because we do have the same data sets that they have on the mainland, which isn't always the case when you try to take mainland tools and use them in Hawaii. So we start with the existing DEM and then any existing mapping of surface water or not even surface water, like agricultural ditches. And so that's also available through the Hawaii State GIS portal. You can download a layer of agricultural ditches. And so that's a good way to start of seeing how water is flowing through the watershed. And so, let's see. From there, we can do an initial run of, so this hydrologically conditioned DEM, even though this is not part of running the PTMApp tool, PTMApp provides the tools to do this conditioning. So if I was to try to do this without using PTMApp products, it would be a pretty cumbersome effort of trying to manually edit this DEM through a lot of kind of intermediate steps in ArcGIS. But PTMApp provides a streamlined couple of buttons that you click to make this whole process a lot easier. So we begin with the raw DEM, and then like Scott said, we start identifying areas such as culverts that go under a highway or different things like that that aren't appearing in the DEM and add those in by drawing in those burn lines that you described. And so there's a couple of different ways of identifying where we need to make these edits. Can use like Google Earth, just doing a lot of satellite imagery exploration, running the first part of this tool and seeing what the surface flow line is being modeled as, and then zooming in and seeing where that's actually not correct based on reality. So I kind of, for my process, I got as far as I could using Google Earth and satellite imagery, and then turned to doing field visits. So actually going to the watershed, and specifically targeting areas that I already know through my Google Earth efforts that I can't really clarify what's going on with the surface water. So in the Kayaka Bay watershed, a lot of that involved how water is being routed across the agricultural fields. They have an extensive system of ditches and culverts and ways to either collect water into reservoirs they have or drain water off of the fields. And so I did site visits and also a lot of correspondence with like the Dole GIS manager, who was able to provide a lot more information on what kind of agricultural water systems they have going on. And for Kayaka Bay, I was able to use my drone to assist me in just getting up above and seeing these ditches from up above. So these pictures on the bottom right are some drone images that I took that were really helpful in getting me to see what things are looking like on the ground. And so based on all of the Google Earth, the site visits, and then iterative processing of this, we're able to get a more refined and accurate look at what the surface hydrology is. And so you can go to the next slide, Scott. And so the immediate output of this hydrologically conditioned DEM is a vastly improved mapping of the surface water within the watershed. So on the left of the screen here is the existing stream mapping, which you can download from the Hawaii State GIS portal. And on the right is the output once we've done our hydrologically conditioned DEM. So we're seeing the major streams, but also a lot of smaller tributaries that run across agricultural fields, residential areas, and make their way to those major streams. So that's really more on the scale of how we can apply this tool, really pinpointing like individual pieces of land, individual properties, really at that fine scale where we can actually think about applying best management practices. And yeah, and so this is a more zoomed in picture of what that's looking like. So on the left, again, is the publicly available streams. And then on the right is after hydrologically conditioning, yeah, just a much finer scale of seeing how water is running across the landscape. And so once this is accomplished, that's the final input to actually running PTMApp tool.
And I think
yeah.
one of the most important things for this, especially if you're going to be doing landowner discussions where you're going out to a landowner and saying, hey, you know, you could put a BMP here because water flows in this part of your field. You want to make sure that the model is accurately showing where water shows in that person's field, because if you show them a location where they know that water doesn't normally accumulate and flow, you've lost a lot of confidence in that model if it's not properly hydro conditioned. So yeah, I know Derek spent a ton of time making sure that everything was as accurate as we could be for reasons like that, because we were going to go out and do stakeholder and landowner meetings. So
yeah,
really important.
And along those lines, I think one of the great powers of this tool is that you know, we can go out, show a landowner what this is looking like, and if we go out there and see that it's not right, it's not hard to go back to the tool, make those adjustments, and get it more accurate to the real world. So yeah, like this tool isn't like locked in, you kind of just have to listen to it. You can go back and easily change it to tighten it up, yeah, to really reflect the real world.
And kind of getting back to what we had discussed earlier about those priority resource points also being an important input. You can see on the map image on the right where we had put those in Kayaka Bay. Those are, again, locations then that we can grab information from the output of PTMApp. Once the model's been run, we can gather information at each one of those locations. So you see down by the outlet near the ocean, you've got points 1 and 2. Well, we can get loading of sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen at those locations or at any other of those green points. And we just put this number of green points because that worked for our watershed, but you could put 100, you can put 200 green points anywhere on those priority resource points, wherever you want to aggregate and summarize data from the model, data on loading of those, you know, annual sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen loading, or annual load reduction benefits of upstream best management practices and things like that. So again, that's something that's locally specific. You get to choose if this is happening in a watershed that you're working on. You can select wherever you want those to be located. And Derek mentioned like USGS gauge sites allow us, if we put a priority resource point at one of those gauge sites, we can compare modeled data to real world measured values from the USGS, or if there's other locations where you know, water quality samples are taken, we can compare those annual load estimates from PTMApp to annual loading calculations from the real world situations or real world data. One of the other things that you can do within PTMApp, and there's a lot of optional tools within the tool, so little sub tools. One of them is called lakes routing. So you can incorporate the location of lakes and reservoirs into the PTMApp data. And what it will do is it will naturally account for the mass of sediment and nutrients that are deposited or retained in those lakes and reservoirs on an annual basis, and prevent that modeled load of sediment and nutrient from moving further downstream. So there's more to it within PTMApp than that, but it'll look at the residence time of water within this reservoir. So water comes in to the reservoir that we're looking at here from two main locations. And once that water moves from the stream into the reservoir, it slows down and loses a lot of energy. And for instance, when you lose energy, the sediment that's being held in the water drops to the bottom of the reservoir and doesn't keep continuing on downstream beyond the reservoir then. So we're modeling the real world again a little bit more accurately by presenting this lake data or reservoir data in this optional tool that's available within PTMApp. And at the outlet of this reservoir, that we have another one of those green dots, which is one of our priority resource points. So again, we can get an estimate of the load of sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen then leaving the reservoir once it's been once the sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen has been, or a portion of that has been retained within the reservoir. We get information then about how much sediment, I'm just going to use that as an example, how much sediment is coming to the reservoir, how much sediment is retained in the reservoir on an annual basis, and then finally at that downstream priority resource point, how much is moving past the reservoir itself. So
Yeah,
that's, oh, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, so I was just gonna add a bit to this. So like in Hawaii, we don't have that many lakes, but we do have, like a couple major reservoirs and such like this. And so, yeah, this is just an added feature of PTMApp tool that, again, can just make things a lot more accurate real world. It looks like there's a question from Alika regarding what's located at the priority resource points. So some of the priority resource points are placed there because there's like a USGS stream gauge, which might be collecting water flow volumes or sediment loads. And so those are values that we can compare to what our model's outputting to make sure they're matching up. And if they're not matching up, then we can make adjustments to our inputs to make sure those are matching up. At a lot of these other priority resource points locations, there isn't actual like a physical thing there at all. It's just a location that we or stakeholders have identified as basically a location of interest. So a lot of these are going to be like where two tributaries meet. So that would be a point where, there's going to be a collection of sediment, and we want to be able to kind of measure that. Other points might be like at the bottom of someone's agricultural field, and we want to be able to get a lot of summarized data on the sediment there. A lot of different locations like that. But yeah, mostly they're just locations that the tool will output a lot of easily summarized data for. So we don't have actual like monitoring devices out at these sites, although that's something that, a future work could definitely align with.
Derek, there's a question from Rebecca. She has her hand up. Or
Yep.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, quick question. So for this lake routing or the lakes and reservoirs, does it also account for wetlands?
It can typically, it's mainly open water bodies, but we can work with the data that goes into this lakes routing process and account for things like wetlands as well. Yep. Otherwise, wetlands can be accounted for as a best management practice within the outputs of the tool as well, depending on how the wetland is functioning within the overall system.
Thanks.
Cool. Alika's asking, are we working with landowners to have access to these sites? I'd say that's kind of like the next step, right? Or Miguel, can you speak a bit to that?
Actually, well, yeah, I mean, I have not I've not really worked with PTMApp operationally, but I do see um I don't know, maybe if Sophie, do you have any insights on how you go about, like, I mean, even outside of the PTMApp context, but how ORCD approaches access to land with with the watershed program?
Sorry, can you rephrase that? What do you mean by access to land?
Um, Actually, well, Alika, could
Sorry,
you maybe
I'm
elaborate your
on a,
question? Because
so if you have a point of interest, right, for a priority resource point on a private landowner's property, how do you then go about getting access to that property to ensure that your data or the information that you're collected is accurate? Because as mentioned earlier, that you only have Google Earth images or drone images. So how do you get, when it's time to get boots on the ground, do you have all the appropriate contacts and participation, I guess?
Okay, yeah. I guess from that perspective, our approach has been we're basically selecting priority resource points that we've had stakeholder engagement with. Like some sites, like where the stream gauges are, those are important for us for our quality control. But a lot of the points are just from stakeholder input, whether they be the landowners or resource managers who just are aware that these sites are, on their mind to be monitoring. So yeah, we're not kind of approaching this as like picking out spots that we don't foresee actually being able to access or interact with.
Thank you.
Then it looks like, Pam, you had a question about the data layers that are required for nutrients. That's a great question because we haven't discussed that. So the data inputs that we have discussed previously are all watershed specific data inputs. There's another folder full of static data that we have for the entire state of Hawaii that has some of the other data layers that are required. So for instance, for nutrients, we need land use. What's the land use type in that area? And then associated with each of the different land use types that are available in our data layer, there's a typical sediment typical phosphorus and nitrogen yield from every acre of land of that type. So we did a research, we researched primary literature for all these different land use types for the island of Hawaii, or as close as we could get to representing the island of Hawaii, to figure out what a typical forested land nitrogen yield is, and what a typical forested land phosphorus yield, and what a typical agricultural land nitrogen phosphorus yield are. And those are all adjustable within the PTMApp tool. So that's the data layer that is used to generate the nutrient loading from the landscape, which is then again moved downstream through those flow paths, and kind of tying this right back into lakes routing, as that both sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen, as all of those are moving down the accumulated flow path, we factor in how much of that phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment is naturally going to be either deposited or reduced through chemical, biological, or physical processes on an annual basis, and not make it to the outlet of the watershed. So for every ton of sediment that is generated at a location, not 1 ton of sediment isn't going to make it all the way down to the end of the outlet of the watershed. Some of it's going to be redeposited. So there are decay coefficients associated with that travel distance and travel time of the water and the sediment and nutrients in that water, to kind of account for how much of the generated sediment and nutrients is going to be redeposited on an annual basis before leaving the watershed outlet. And the lake routing process is just an extension of that. So how much would naturally be captured in the lake and redeposited before it makes it to the outlet of the watershed. I hope that answers that question. So there is actually a lot more data that goes into the tool, but it's all static data that's already been created, and the user So like Derek wouldn't have to do anything with that data. It's available as an input. The inputs that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, those are all things that you need to do for every new watershed that's created. But we've got this big file of other data that's going to be able to be used for the entire state of Hawaii. Good questions. And yeah, I really like just asking the questions when you got them, because then everyone probably has the same question at the same time, or, you know, maybe not as comfortable to ask a question. So that's what I always appreciate when people ask that question. All right, we'll keep moving on and keep the questions coming as you've got them. So Derek, I know from your perspective in creating some of these input data layers, a lot of the data was available through the Hawaii statewide GIS program, but not everything, right?
Yeah, most of it is available. So like right now we're looking at land use, land cover mapping, and so this is a nationwide data set that's available, which luckily is also available for Hawaii. And so yeah, it's not exactly the same data set that I think you guys work with in Minnesota, but it's comparable enough and high resolution enough for us to use in Hawaii.
Yeah, so with this is a great example, because this is one of the layers that we had to adjust slightly. We need land use for PTMApp, but the PTMApp land use layer that we use here in Minnesota and throughout the upper Midwest is the NLCD land use, which has a very specific format to how the data is processed. So we'd had to take the land use data that was available for Hawaii and just modify it slightly so that the land use categories matched up with that NLCD land use type that PTMApp requires. So that was one of the data layers that we had to adjust. There's also a lot of other things within the PTMApp tool that are adjustable, because think about it this way: it was made in Minnesota for the upper Midwest. Well, that's very different than how things are in Hawaii. But luckily the tool is adjustable and modifiable enough where we can change things to, again, help the model more accurately represent how things are in Hawaii. So we talked about just recently about how land use is used for nutrient loading to estimate the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen moving from the landscape into the receiving water bodies. Well, we were able to find Hawaii specific information about those typical nutrient yield values from the different land use types specific to Hawaii. So we're not using Minnesota default data here. We're using Hawaii specific information. That's just one of the examples of how we were able to alter some of the default parameters within the model to, again, help it more accurately represent how things are actually working on the landscape in Hawaii. And there's, on the right hand of the screen is just a screenshot of a technical memorandum that was created specifically for doing that, taking data and adjusting it to Hawaii standards to make sure that it was more appropriate for modeling water and nutrient and sediment flow in Hawaii.
Yeah, and this document that he's showing, this is a great document that Houston Engineering put together that really spells out pretty easily understandably the data sets that we needed, their default values, and how those were adjusted to make them more Hawaii specific.
So not to get into too much more technical stuff, but if you are interested in some of the more nitty-gritty details of PTMApp and the science behind how the tool's actually working and some of the other specifics, on the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources website, there is a PTMApp theory documentation and user guide page that has a bunch of the scientific documentation that is can explain some of the scientific methodology behind how the tool's working, some of the more specific information about individual processes within PTMApp, how the tool has evolved throughout the years. So in roughly around 2020, PTMApp had a fairly major overhaul, so you can learn about the adjustments and advancements that were created within the toolbar since then. So yeah, if anyone's interested in looking deeper into the tool, feel free to either visit some of these websites, or if it's after the meeting and you don't remember these long annoying web links, feel free to email me and I can send you a link to the theory website. All right, now we can spend a little time talking about how we actually go about quality controlling the data, because like Derek said, a lot of data comes out of this, but we want to make sure that it's good data. So we've got a fairly intensive process of checking the data that comes out of PTMApp against real world information. And there's, again, one of those important things that we make sure we put priority resource points, for instance, at locations where real world data is being collected that we can then compare against to do a quality control of the PTMApp results to make sure that the data is aligning with reality. So Derek, I know you spent quite a bit of time quality controlling all of the data that you processed.
Yeah, and actually, I thought maybe we could, if I could go ahead and share my screen of.
Here, I'll stop sharing and.
Yeah, I thought I didn't have this in the slides, but I thought it might be helpful for you guys to see. So, so we had all our input data, made the hydro DEM, got all the input layers specific for Hawaii. And so actually running the tool, this is actually what it looks like. So right now we're in ArcGIS. And so the PTMApp tool is like a plugin for ArcGIS. So it's right here. And to run it, it's actually, you kind of go through a series of tools that you run. So you kind of just go in order, run this tool, run that tool, and they have a whole series of tools that are run, kind of just run them in order. If something doesn't run, then you have to pause there, get it to run, and then continue down the line. So you're running all these tools. I mean, most of them are super simple. You just open it up and press run. Some of them have like some input values that you have to just check and make sure they're good. But yeah, it's fairly streamlined. And once you run all that, then you can turn to, or kind of as you're running it, you can also start doing quality control, because each of those individual tools that you run, you're going to start getting outputs. And as they're running, you want to just kind of check to make sure these output numbers are looking good, because they also kind of feed into subsequent outputs. Cool. You can bring back up your slides, Scott.
All righty. There we go.
Yeah.
I'm just confirming.
So, yeah, looks good. So yeah, again, a lot of time spent on preparing the inputs. And then as far as running PTMApp, pretty simple, just clicking through their tools, running them, and then you get to the next really involved step, which is quality control. And so you saw all those tools that you run. So there's about 130 input and output layers, that most of them are output layers that come out of this tool. And so you want to give each of those at least a cursory check to make sure that the numbers are looking good in them. From my experience of running them, 90% of them are going to run fine. You're going to get great values, but there are a couple that we got weird numbers for, had to go back, make some adjustments to the inputs. Mostly those were like, at a given location in the watershed, how much stream flow basically would you see in a year? Maybe we check that against the USGS stream gauge at that location and find that our numbers are not matching up. We were able to go back, make adjustments, and get those numbers to match up. And so yeah, that's what this quality control is all about. So sorry, if you could go back.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, and so we keep track of this quality control process through this really big Excel spreadsheet that Houston Engineering has put together. And so you saw those different tabs for the tools that we run in ArcGIS. Those correspond to, we've got a bunch of tabs down here at the bottom of this spreadsheet. And so in each of those tabs is all of the outputs that you have to check. And so you can just easily put in, you know, min, max, mean values for those outputs. And there's a bunch of good notes in here on like what kind of numbers you should be expecting to see. And so you kind of just take the time to work through each of these, fill them out, make sure that they're all passing before you move on. Yeah, cool. That's good, Scott. And then, yeah, like I said, a lot of our quality control is being informed by comparing to real world data. So the first place we look is for USGS stream gauge data. In each of the watersheds that we piloted this on, we've had at least 2 or more stream gauges to be able to compare our values to. So that's a lot more reassuring when you can be getting kind of real world numbers both up in the watershed and maybe down at the bottom of the watershed. That gives you a lot of confidence that things are being modeled correctly throughout the watershed. Other than the USGS data, we also turn to any other reliable source of information that we can find. So state water quality information, different academic research papers, yeah, any kind of really solid numbers that we can pin our model numbers to. Yeah, you want to say more about this, Scott?
Yeah, and I think any adjustments that we have made to the default parameters within the tool or any of the values are not just adjustments to make sure our outputs match the real world. It's we're making adjustments based on other information, other scientific literature that we found that's area specific. So again, we're not going to just tweak something because we want it to match better. We're going to do it based on some scientific backed information or data that's been collected for the area, or at least nearby area. And that's going to help us, again, have our outputs from the model much more closely represent what's happening in the real world. And it's going to give us a better estimate of, you know, the effects that we could have on water quality then by implementing best management and conservation practices. So I think there are a lot of other options or locations within the toolbar through all those tools that Derek showed us, where we can make modifications to those default parameters, and we do when necessary, and we leave things as default as needed. But all those adjustments again are based on local information and research data. So we adjusted things for Hawaii, like the landscape nutrient yield values. Some overland sediment delivery ratio information. We had adjusted some of that. BMP costs can be adjusted, and there's a bunch of other things that can be tweaked and adjusted to make it, again, more locally specific and make sure those results are going to be the most beneficial they can be for the watershed that you're working in. All right, so now we've worked through creating all the inputs. We've gone through and run the PTMApp toolbar. We've quality controlled the data. Now, what do we do with it? There's a lot of data that we can use. So I think I'll spend the next, I don't know, bit of time talking about some of the different ways that we have used the PTMApp outputs, not only in Hawaii, but elsewhere as well. So again, the PTMApp tool, it's the prioritize, target, and measure tool. So the first thing we can do is, how do we use PTMApp outputs to prioritize where we want to focus our efforts, focus our money, focus our resources on trying to have the biggest water quality benefit for all the dollars spent. So one of the things we can do is look at where sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen loading or leaving the landscape is the highest. So where those highest yield values are, and we can analyze that on multiple scales. So remember, PTMApp is a scalable model. We can look at it down to the individual meter by meter cells that PTMApp's actually processing things on, or as we see in the left side of the screen, as part of the processing of the toolbar, PTMApp divides the entire watershed up into roughly 40-acre small catchments. So we can look at the sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen being generated in those catchments and leaving or getting to the edge of those catchments, which potentially would then have it move further downstream. So we can look at the edge of field sediment and phosphorus loading for each one of those individual catchments to help us find, you know, hot spots on the landscape where there's higher sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen potential for it to move downstream. And that can help us to maybe focus our efforts on those areas that have the highest sediment and nutrient yields to help reduce those really bad areas on the landscape. So we can analyze that loading on that individual catchment scale, or on the right side of the image, we can look at those same catchments, but see how much of that sediment and nutrient load that's generated in that catchment actually makes it downstream to a priority resource point of our choosing. So you can see right at the outlet of the watershed, I've got one of those green dots, I've got it highlighted in blue. So the map then is showing us the sediment, in this case, that is being generated in each one of those roughly 40-acre catchments that actually makes it all the way downstream to the outlet of the watershed on an annual basis. So again, if we've got fragile habitat just offshore and we want to prevent sediment from making it all the way down to the outlet of the watershed and potentially damaging that habitat, the analyzing things on the priority resource point scale is going to give us a different location priority for where we may want to invest more resources for preventing sediment moving downstream, for instance. So we can analyze and prioritize that pollutant prevention based on these different types of source assessments. Do we want to just prevent sediment loss everywhere on a local scale, or do we want to prevent sediment loading, phosphorus loading, nitrogen loading to a specific point in the watershed? And again, that's something where if you have a total maximum daily load for nutrients or sediment in a specific water body, you'd want to look at putting a priority resource point at that water body, and then you can analyze how much sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen is reaching that point to allow you to kind of focus your efforts on how do we implement the most cost-effective practices to reduce the sediment and nutrients from reaching that impaired water body or that point of interest within your watershed. So that's one way that you can use the PTMApp outputs to prioritize your efforts, prioritize your resources, and help you at least get a general idea of where you may want to start targeting your conservation efforts. Now, the outputs from the tool can also help you establish water quality goals for your watershed. So if you know you want to have an effect on a water body, we can look at information at that location in the watershed. So again, if we're looking at the outlet of the watershed as a whole, if there's a priority resource point at that watershed, we can get annual estimated sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen loading to that point. And let's say we want to reduce sediment loading by 25% to help us protect an offshore habitat, or to help reduce sedimentation to a reservoir or something like that. The model is going to show us then a rough annual estimate of how much sediment or nutrients is reaching that point. And that's going to then help us establish our water quality goal of how much of that pollutant do we want to reduce, which then we can take that information later on in the tool and find the best management and conservation practices that are going to most effectively help us reach that water quality goal that we've set for a water body. Now, moving on to targeting. So we've got an area where we prioritize, maybe where we want to start focusing our efforts. We can use PTMApp to target individual locations within that. So for instance, when on some of our pilot projects, we've engaged landowners and taken actual PTMApp data in map form to those landowners and talked with them. And Derek, I know you joined along with some of those and have had probably significantly more interaction with individual landowners than I have. How have you used the PTMApp data to interact with people on the ground.
Yeah, so so this image on the right, this map on the right is kind of a perfect example of that. It looks kind of crazy, it's got all kind of stuff going on, but what you're seeing is each color or each kind of symbology is a different potential best management practice that could be happening on each piece of land to reduce sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So these are PTMApp outputs, best management practices prescribed to specific pieces on the land. And if we focus on this kind of pink outlined with the red cross-hatching right in the middle, yep, that piece right there. So this is actually a location that we're currently engaged, ORCD is currently engaging with the landowners there to do best management practices. And I know Sophie's kind of directly involved in this project. So I think that project was actually initiated before we got these PTMApp outputs, but we're able to zoom in on this area that they're already kind of thinking about doing work in and see that PTMApp is also prescribing best management practices for that same area. And so kind of just our initial kind of gut check of this tool's outputs is looking really promising that, you know, it's thinking the same way that we're thinking. So it's finding the same spot that we've already identified, and it's finding all these other spots that, you know, if there's interest and funding, could do additional best management practicing at. If we look at the 4 images on the left side of the screen, these are kind of just 4 ways of visualizing this piece of land area. So top left box is just identifying really steeply sloped areas within this piece of kind of look like ranch land maybe. So those would be just areas where, you know, there's a lot of steep slope where you might be getting a lot of runoff. Top right image is, it's pretty hard to see those blue lines, but those are kind of like the specific courses that surface water is going to tend to take as it runs downhill. So those would be like more specific strips of land where you might want to do some management. The bottom left image, well, this aligns closely with the top left image, is but it's identifying areas with a lot of sediment loss potential. So high slope areas, you're going to see a lot of sediment loss in those areas. And then the bottom right is kind of like what the map on the right is showing. Given all these different elements of the landscape, these are where you might want to do some best management practices. And I believe the coloring here is colored by how many tons of sediment runoff per year that you'll reduce by doing management at each of those areas. So yeah, different ways of visualizing the outputs and how they're playing out on your landscape.
Yeah, and this is just a few of the different ways that, or bits of information that you could provide to the landowners if you're wanting to meet with them. It all depends on you know, your relationship with that landowner. If you know they're interested in implementing BMPs, you might want to show them the image on the right. But if you know that they're more interested in preventing gully erosion, you might want to show them that area of accumulated flow, that top right image. It's all going to depend on your knowledge of the landowner, or how you want to present the data to them to be received in the best way. And this is just, again, this is just a few of the data outputs and how you could use them to go to a landowner and say, you know, management practices, conservation practices could be implemented here, there, wherever, and here's what the estimated benefit on water quality or on erosion prevention could be. So there's tons of BMPs that are provided by PTMApp by default. They're all technically feasible, again, based on NRCS design criteria. That's what PTMApp is doing. It's hard coded with a bunch of criteria, and it's looking to see if things like slope are between this percent and that percent, or if the upstream drainage area to a BMP meets a very specific criteria. So they may all be feasible BMPs based on PTMApp's output, but not everyone wants to implement a specific BMP in a specific area. Different BMPs are more popular than others. So we did between Houston and ORC&D and Derek, we kind of did a rough feeler of what types of BMPs people in the area of Oʻahu like to implement, what they're not likely to implement, and we can kind of narrow down our BMPs that we would present to people based on what's preferred in the area. So the table on the right, you can see that, farm ponds and wetlands are not very commonly implemented, but water and sediment control basins are. And we can, again, narrow down the information that we would present to a landowner at that point, or also, help us kind of narrow down the amount of data that we have to analyze if we're trying to create an implementation scenario of a series of BMPs. If we know that certain BMPs aren't going to be implemented within the watershed, we don't have to incorporate those into our analysis of potential options. Now, with all of the BMPs that are output from PTMApp, again, you can see a map with lots of colorful blobs on it. Each one of those represents an individual BMP of one of those 24 typical BMP types that is presented from PTMApp. We can take all that information and try to come up with a scenario of those BMPs. So a selection of the feasible BMPs to help us meet a water quality improvement goal. And there's a lot of different ways of going about that, a lot of different BMPs that can be selected and implemented in different parts of the watershed to help us achieve that goal. Again, depending on what our watershed goal is, what our water quality goals are. Are we trying to reduce sediment? Are we trying to reduce phosphorus or nitrogen? Different BMPs will be better or worse at reducing sediment or nutrients. So PTMApp allows us this wide range of potential options to help us meet those water quality goals in a way that's going to align with landowners and the landscape that we're working with. And there's not going to be one right answer. There's multiple ways we can achieve that goal. And again, PTMApp allows lots of opportunities and lots of different options of BMPs and conservation practices to help us meet that goal. And the data that is behind each of these BMPs, you can see some tables on the right side of the screen. We're able, with the PTMApp data, to figure out what our water quality benefit, our load reduction potential of implementing a BMP is, not only at the field edge. So you can see here, we've got a reduced tillage BMP showing up in PTMApp. We can get the estimate of the sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen load reduction of implementing reduced tillage on this field, as if we were to go out and take water quality measurements right here at the edge of the field. Or we can specify, I want to get that water quality benefit of that BMP at any other downstream priority resource point. And again, that's going to factor in some of that natural redeposition of sediment that would have happened even if the BMP wasn't there, or that natural chemical, physical, biological reduction of phosphorus as that water's moving downstream naturally, whether or not the BMP is. So we can measure that load reduction benefit at any specified point within the watershed, as long as we've got a priority resource point at that location. And I see that, Sophie, you've got a question.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, if we're looking at fields that look like they're actively being worked, what is like the baseline assumption for the land management? Are we taking into account what they're currently doing, specifically if people are tilling or doing no-till, or is it the same assumption across the board?
So most of the PTMApp BMPs assume you're doing a conventional tillage practice right now, and you're moving to this best management practice, which might be reduce tillage or no tillage. However, again, as one of the adjustable parameters within PTMApp, you can specify the estimated load reduction efficiency of your BMPs. So if you know that most of the farms here are already implementing reduced tillage and they want to go to no tillage, if you have information about what the estimated load reduction potential would be moving from that one BMP type to a slightly more intensive BMP type, you can include that information into the underlying PTMApp data, and that'll factor in the work that's already being done on the landscape. And also, one of the other things that you can adjust as one of the inputs is there's all of those Russell layers, the revised universal soil loss equation layers. One of those accounts for current management on the landscape. So you can adjust that Russell input to say there already is, cover crops, or there already is some sort of land management application in this area that is beginning at the beginning already starting to reduce that potential, soil loss, the soil loss potential. So you can factor in existing management practices in a couple different ways within PTMApp. If that answers your question.
Okay, great. Yes, that totally answers the question. Thank you.
It just would involve a little bit more data collection up front and adjusting against some of those inputs. Yep. But again, you can develop a BMP implementation scenario to meet your water quality goal wherever that water quality goal is established. If it's a just barely downstream priority resource point, we can look at the data that's within PTMApp and find the best implementation scenario to meet that water quality goal at that location. If it's we're looking at trying to reduce sediment or nutrients at the outlet of the watershed, that might lead us to a different implementation scenario of BMPs, a different list of BMPs that we could implement to meet that water quality goal. It's all dependent on how you want to frame your goals and how you want to go about achieving those goals. Because we can, again, look at BMPs that just reduce the most sediment they can as possible, regardless of the cost. We know if we implement these 3 BMPs, we're going to probably come really close to meeting our goal. Or, like everything is, money matters. So maybe we want to try and find many smaller BMPs that have a better cost to load reduction ratio than those few really big BMPs. It's all dependent on how you want to frame your goal and achieve that goal. You can come up with various implementation scenarios to allow you to do that in a number of different ways. Again, just because of the amount of data that PTMApp generates, it allows a lot of flexibility. And we'll talk about, in another couple slides, we'll talk about some of the other tools that have been developed to increase that flexibility even more. So then once we've come up with our theoretical implementation scenario of a list of BMPs that are going to hopefully help us meet our water quality goals, we can then measure that overall load reduction benefit of that implementation scenario. So here's just an output of one of the scenarios that we came up with for a different watershed that we were working with. It's a series of BMPs that if we implement them on the landscape, you can see it's a large number of different BMPs. If we implement all of those, in theory, we should be able to meet our downstream water quality goal. And this is just one scenario, but it's the way we can at least begin to start talking to landowners and going out into the public and saying, hey, would you be willing to think about maybe implementing a BMP here to help meet our overall water quality goals? That's one way of going about it. You can go to the landowners and talk to them, or sometimes if they're very interested and active, they can come to you and see if their ideas fit within your implementation plan or scenario. And again, PTMApp has all of the information in it for you to progressively track your progress towards meeting your water quality goals. If you have any, you can go in and say, we've implemented these certain practices collectively our water quality benefit based on PTMApp output would show that we're reducing sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen loading to whatever location in our watershed by X amount per year. So you can measure and track your progress towards your water quality goals as things are being implemented. And Derek, is there anything else that you want to see based on your experiences working with people or the data that could expand upon this at all? I just figured I'd open it up to you just in case. I don't want to cut you off, and if you've got anything else to add.
No, I mean, yeah, kind of as far as the work we've put into this so far, we're kind of reaching this point right here where it's time to really pinpoint what kind of goals we want to pursue and how we can try to accomplish that. So, I mean, I guess personally for me, so far we've kind of been looking at this on like the smaller scale of like we showed that example of that individual property where you know, the BMPs that PTMApp was outputting matched well with the ones that they're actually implementing. But then to think about it at this like kind of larger scale, like what you're showing here, think about multiple properties throughout the landscape and how those cumulatively, you know, end up at water quality goals way downstream is kind of, to me, that's kind of an exciting kind of larger scale way to think about this tool.
Yeah, and this is what we're looking at here is kind of one of the ways that we do watershed management in Minnesota is through creating these comprehensive watershed management plans. And part of those plans is establishing your goals and then coming up with a scenario to help you meet your goals. So what we're looking at here is one of those goal-based implementation scenarios that works on that much larger scale of, we've got these goals, here's one way to achieve those, you know, over the next decade or 20 years or however long it may be. Now, kind of moving along with that, the measurement of load reduction benefit potential of BMPs is not limited to just, you know, going to talk to landowners and coming up with implementation scenarios. The information that you can get out of PTMApp can also be used to support water quality components of federal planning grants. So if you are applying for a grant that's to help you, you know, get grant funding to start implementing some BMPs within your landscape, you can use PTMApp outputs to meet some of those granting requirements for measuring water quality benefits of implemented BMPs. So the EPA 319 grants is an example that has a requirement of measuring your water quality benefits of the BMPs that were implemented through the funding from this grant opportunity. That's the EPA 319 is just one example. There's lots of grants out there. Many of them have certain requirements like this, where you could use PTMApp data to meet that water quality component of the federal or state grant. So that's just another way that you can use PTMApp data to, again, help further along and more rapidly implement management and conservation practices on the landscape. Another use of PTMApp data that we've used occasionally is you can take information from PTMApp and feed that information into other water quality models that can help you kind of expand the usefulness and utility of that PTMApp data. So for instance, there was a project that we worked on in North Dakota, which was a reservoir that we were looking at. The reservoir had some water quality issues. Phosphorus was higher than they wanted the concentrations to be in the reservoir, so fish were dying because the phosphorus concentration was too high, which led to big algae blooms. So we used PTMApp to try to get estimates of phosphorus loading into the reservoir, and once we gathered that data, we could put that information into a different water quality model that was reservoir specific for figuring out what the water quality conditions in that reservoir could be if we adjusted some of those inputs, or if we reduced phosphorus loading to the watershed. So this other model called Bathtub requires annual phosphorus loading into the reservoir, and we were able to take that PTMApp data as an input into this phosphorus model and run a series of scenarios to say, how would the water quality in the reservoir change if phosphorus increased, if it decreased? Because one of the other things that was being considered for this watershed was diverting a large portion of additional land and runoff from that land also into the reservoir. So you can see the image on the left, it was the current at the time drainage area to that reservoir. So we were able to get phosphorus loading from that portion of the landscape. Spillway was proposed that would take runoff from a large chunk of additional land, the middle slide there, and route that also into the reservoir. So we were able to see the effects that including water and runoff from that spillway diversion would have on the lake, which, or the reservoir. In that case, it would add a lot more phosphorus. So we could see, based on the additional loading of phosphorus and that data that we were able to get from PTMApp and then feed into the bathtub model, what effect that would have, that addition of that additional runoff would have on water quality within the reservoir. So you can use PTMApp data kind of out of the confines of PTMApp to help inform other models or other projects. That's just another way that we were able to take that PTMApp data and kind of expand on its utility. Now, over the years, there's been some companion tools that have been created, again, free to use, available to be downloaded by anyone who wants to, that take PTMApp data and either make the data easier to work with or expand upon its utility. So there's a tool called the Spruce tool, which is summarized by priority resource. You can take any location that has underlying PTMApp data and focus on a sub-watershed, a smaller area of the overall study watershed, and say, I just want the most important data from this portion of the watershed. And the Spruce tool will take all that underlying PTMApp data and get rid of any spatial data that's outside of that area of interest where you want to analyze it. And also it takes all the underlying data tables that are associated with some of these spatial features and reduce the amount of data that you have to analyze by kind of getting rid of the uncommonly used data fields and columns of data, and just give you like the most commonly used information for that one specific part of the watershed that you're looking at. So you can see here on the right side, that's just a little watershed that we use for testing of some of our tools. And I told the Spruce tool, hey, I only care about the headwaters area of that. And I only want to see this output and this information about certain BMPs. And the Spruce tool then takes all of the data from the entire watershed and just clips out the relevant data that I told I wanted it. And it gives me that in a nice little package. So it's so much easier for me then to go into that data folder and look at and pick out the information and the data that I'm specifically looking for. It gets rid of some of the clutteriness of the data. Another tool that's been created more recently is called the Buddy tool, the BMP user-defined digital interface. And that allows users of the PTMApp data, as long as there's underlying PTMApp data, again, you can input a polygon. So input a blob on a map, like you can see on the lower left. We've got a little triangular shaped green polygon and a tan oddly shaped polygon. Those are BMPs that were implemented on the landscape, but did not actually come out of the PTMApp tool. Because like I said earlier, the PTMApp toolbar uses NRCS design criteria, and it's very rigid because it's a computer code. It's very rigid on whether or not it says a BMP is feasible in a location or not. Real world scenario, you get something that might just fall a little bit outside of that NRCS design criteria, but might still be a feasible BMP to implement. Well, the Buddy tool allows you then to put that spatial data of where your BMP is, but still process that information then through the latter half of the PTMApp toolbar. So you get all of the water quality benefits, all the cost estimates, all the standard PTMApp output data for that BMP, or those BMPs in this case, that weren't part of the standard PTMApp output. So again, just extending the utility of the PTMApp data and the underlying data to make it a little bit more universally useful in different landscapes. And there's other tools on the horizon as well that'll do hydrologic analysis. So what kind of hydrologic impact implementing a BMP will have on downstream flow and hydrographs. So if I put a wetland here, or a reservoir, or some sort of water holding body, will it reduce the likelihood of flooding downstream? That's something that's in the works. It's not quite done yet, but should be coming soon. Sophie, you have a question?
Yeah, so just to for clarity, if we were to be prescribed a BMP through PTMApp, and say the acreage of the BMP was smaller, or yeah, and just in a different location, that's something that we would address through the buddy tool?
You sure could. Yep. So
Okay.
that's one of the things with PTMApp BMPs is oftentimes they're split up along the hydrologic boundaries that PTMApp creates, but fields aren't always defined by hydrologic boundaries. So you could actually draw in the perimeter of the field if you're going to implement, a best management practice like cover crops, for instance, or reduce tillage on that entire field. You could outline that and import it into the buddy tool, and then get the overall water quality benefit of that entire field. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
So all in all, that's kind of the big high level overview of what PTMApp is, how we use it to generate data and make sure that that data is useful and reliable and realistic, and then how we can take that data and use it in a varied number of ways on the landscape for prioritizing, targeting, and measuring those best management and conservation practices. And again, we've done this in Hawaii now on 2 pilot watersheds, but I think we're moving into the phase now of how we expand the use, if it's useful for people in Hawaii and neighboring islands, and where we go from here. And I think this is kind of the plan where, or the time where I plan to open it up for Miguel and Derek and anyone else on the call to tell us what the future plans are for PTMApp, or anyone in the group, if there are any other questions about what we discussed, or where PTMApp can also be applied. I think we've reached that point. I've heard me talk enough now.
Thanks. I saw your hand was still up, Sophie, but that was just from before, right? Yeah, actually, I just wanted to maybe give more space for our other participants to chime in. I mean, I do feel like, we have kind of taken this approach of, if you build it, they will come. And now, you guys have shown up, but, we want to know how we can improve it, or how we can make it useful for you. I mean, I think that the past 2 years have just been a process of, it's more of like a feasibility assessment kind of a thing. And now we're at the step where, like, okay, we want to make this operational. I mean, I think a lot of the questions that have come up have really been more about, like, how do we use this operationally? And I feel like we've been, still in this pilot stage of just assessing the effectiveness of it. But I do feel like there's definitely a lot of work to be done in terms of actually engaging with stakeholders, or maybe even coming up with a more comprehensive watershed-wide management plan, rather than dealing with, producers on an individual basis, for example. So yeah, I'd actually like to kind of open up the space for anyone to chime in and see, how they think that this could be useful for them, or whether they still have questions or concerns or doubts or anything like that. So feel free.
Yeah, I have some thoughts if you don't mind. Hi everyone, Rebecca Candilasa. I'm with the Department of Health. We actually administer our the state's 319 grant program. So this is highly useful and of interest to us. I just want to thank RC&D and everyone, the team, Derek, Minnesota team, everyone for working on this and putting this together and getting us to this point. I think this is essentially what our program is looking for, right? And so we're looking for that pollutant source assessment. We're looking for people to be able to calculate what the load reductions are, to prioritize BMPs, target BMPs, and again prioritize. And the way we're doing this is we're looking for watershed management plans, and we're looking at it to be done at a watershed scale. So we're looking for watershed management plans to be developed, and that's how we can award our funding to implement some of these projects. And right now, the onus is on the applicant, or the organization who's putting the plans together, and for them to figure out how do we calculate load reductions, and that seems to always be a tough barrier to cross. Seems like there's a lot of information out there in terms of the characterization of the watershed and just BMPs and what we can do to help improve water quality, but it's calculating the loads that always seems to be the most difficult part. And water quality is complex. It's hard to really pin these things down, but it seems like having a tool like this could help to bring down that barrier, or at least have a lower barrier to bar to enter. And so I guess my question or thoughts was, what would be the major challenges that you see in implementing something like this statewide, where if DOH or some other partner that we worked with housed this tool and could provide this information to people interested working in the watershed and making and implementing these BMPs, so what would be the major challenges to doing this statewide?
I guess in my opinion, and Derek can probably back me up on this, creating some of those inputs for various parts of the state would be the most time consuming and costly. Actually running the tool is fairly easy, but creating that hydrologically conditioned elevation model is a challenging thing. That's probably the biggest barrier to actually getting PTMApp done in other areas, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd say along the same lines. Yeah, just doing that pretty watershed specific input data kind of preparation. It takes, like the individual watershed knowledge input from the experts and someone who can kind of keep track of that and digitize it through GIS.
And Rebecca,
Yeah.
maybe I could just add quickly to that, to Drew Kessler with Houston Engineering. I know I've met several of you before when we were fortunate enough to be out there on the island with you guys. It was a great time getting to visit. Glad to be here as well too, virtually. I think that's right. So first barrier is foundational data. That's the process of building the data. I think the next thing you want to prepare for, though, is accessibility to the data and ability to use. So we got Derek and Scott presenting here today, who are at the moderate to expert GIS level at least. I think you guys would need to also then explore, once the foundational data is built, the training and systems needed to make it broadly accessible within the islands. We got some examples here from Minnesota that we didn't dive into today because it was more about the foundational data and as Miguel highlighted quite well, kind of this feasibility of deploying it on the islands. But I think that would be after you get the foundational data in place, making sure it's accessible and usable across the islands.
In Minnesota, is it currently accessible to everyone, or how's it used in Minnesota?
I'll comment a little bit, and Scott, you back me up here. The vast majority of our agricultural regions in the state do have this data. If you're not familiar with Minnesota, kind of the northern part and the northeastern part are largely forested. It's not used as much there, but in our agricultural regions, it's pretty broadly available. I would say the majority of users, though, do not interact with GIS itself. That's a smaller group who have GIS expertise. The majority of people in the state interact with the data, and it is, yes, available to the public where it's around, either through a web-based platform or a spreadsheet version of the data. Scott,
Yeah,
does that seem right to you?
Yeah, yep. So up on the screen right now is just an example of what Minnesota's web-based data visualization tool is. It's just a static storehouse of the PTMApp data. So you're not running a model, you're not doing anything like that, but it's a way that people around here can interact with that data and maybe start to work on prioritizing, you know, where they want to implement BMPs, because you can look at things like what's shown on the map here is the darker the blob, the more likely or the higher potential sediment load reduction. So you can interact with the data online in that way without actually having to be a technical expert in GIS. That's one way that people interact with it here.
and it allows the same to be able to customize it in the same way. In terms of, like, you know, if what is it, the implementation scenarios and whatnot.
Yep. So, and again, that's kind of specific to the way Minnesota has their web PTMApp web environment set up. Is there are tools within this. You can see along the dark bar at the top, there's something called a scenario builder, where you can kind of at least build an initial setup of feasible BMPs to help you meet a water quality goal.
Thank you.
And then I want to bring up one last barrier that we aren't addressing through the pilot, but I think you'll see it in some of the final reports that get written up. And this actually came from stakeholders on the island through some of the initial engagements. The naming conventions that are standard in PTMApp are very mainland. So I think there is, when I said the word accessibility, there's a technology solution there too, but there's a communication piece that still needs to be worked through to adapt some of those conventions to better fit the way that, you know, the people of Hawaii refer to the land.
I see.
Pam, I see that you had a question in the chat, and I think Drew alluded to it. Yeah, PTMApp is, the question is, are there examples of where you have used this in urban or suburban areas, or does it mainly apply to agricultural lands? The siting of BMPs specifically, they're mainly agricultural BMPs, so you're going to have most of those feasible BMP locations in agricultural areas. And Drew mentioned that northeastern Minnesota is mainly forested, and PTMApp isn't used as heavily there because it is more of an agricultural centric BMP tool. At least you can still get all of the same loading information, the same hydrologic information in those areas. You just might not have as many BMP options that come out of the toolbar naturally. And yes, the secondary question you had is this open source? It's a free tool. You can go down to the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources website and download it and play around with it if you really want to. So it's free for everybody. Yep.
And you had mentioned BMPs could be added. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So as long as they align with one of the 24 standard BMP types, you can pretty easily put in your own BMPs. There are other ways if it's not one of those typical 24 BMPs that's part of PTMApp. There are ways around that, so you can implement other BMPs as long as they treat water, sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen in the same way as the BMPs that are already part of PTMApp. We can input different load reduction efficiency values for a BMP and kind of trick PTMApp into on an individual basis, thinking it's processing one of the normal BMPs, even if it's not a standard PTMApp BMP. There are exceptions though, because there are BMPs that treat water and reduce sediment, phosphorus, nitrogen in ways that are outside of the way PTMApp typically calculates those load reduction estimates. In that case, that would be a significantly bigger lift of like redoing code, and I don't think that's a feasible option.
One more question, sorry.
No, just keep them coming.
Is there, this might be a stretch, but groundwater inputs to, I guess, like downstream water bodies, is that accounted for in any way?
No, PTMApp is strictly a surface water quality model. Yeah, and I know that's a big issue, especially in the central part of the island, where it's just very complicated groundwater systems. PTMApp doesn't account for that. It's strictly surface water and strictly field-based calculations. So even in-stream and near-stream sedimentation and loading isn't always accounted for within PTMApp.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's especially with our on-site wastewater systems, it's becoming a very important question and issue. Okay, good to know. Thanks.
But that is, I mean, that's a really good question and something that we deal with here in the southeastern part of the state. We have karst topography, lots of sinkholes and caves where water can just disappear into the ground. And I know in that part of the state, we've been working with some people who are using that information to help them prioritize where they want certain BMPs. You don't want to put a storage BMP that's going to trap water on the land surface if it's going to potentially, increase nitrogen infiltration into your groundwater system. So that information at least can be used alongside PTMApp data to, again, help you prioritize where certain BMPs may or may not be as feasible.
Thank you.
I had another question. Are we able to input different species of crops in places that are getting BMP implementation, or different species of plants for vegetative BMPs, similarly to how you would with Russell?
At the moment, I'm thinking of the nutrient estimates, at least. No, it's based on NLCD land use classifications, which are pretty coarse. So it's agriculture, it's pasture land, it's 3 different kinds of forest. It breaks it down to. Depending on what you want to analyze, though, again, if you're looking at sedimentation, there's another Russell, that revised universal soil loss equation component that you can adjust based on the differences in how different agricultural crops, protect the landscape or leave it open for more sediment loss. But that would be pretty technical adjustments on a crop by crop basis. I don't know, Drew, do you have anything that you can add to that?
No, I think you got it.
Okay, got it. And are the results, like, what's the time quantification on that? Is it annual reductions?
So the loading within PTMApp is estimated on an annual basis. So annual sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen load to different parts of the watershed. The load reduction estimates within PTMApp are for a given design storm event. So a storm event of a specific intensity. So we've got a 2-year 24-hour storm event is a typical storm that would happen once every 2 years, or a 10-year storm event. Some of the values from that we can pull out and approximate as what the annual load reduction benefit would be of that BMP. So typically we do the load reduction of a BMP given a 2-year 24-hour storm event as equivalent to what an annual load reduction would be for those BMPs.
Got it. Thank you.
And I guess just to get into that just a tiny bit further, the reason that PTMApp does that is because certain BMPs become less efficient under more extreme storm events. So we can get a little bit more information about how much load reduction potential there would be for a given BMP under different intensity conditions, different use conditions.
I was curious in Minnesota, who actually ran the model? Was it the state that did the individual runs and then, you know, published that data?
It's a little bit of everything. So we've got individual watershed partners that we work with, or soil and water conservation districts. Some of those have run their own prioritized target and measure application data on their specific watersheds. A lot of it comes through that clean water grant funding. So large scale watersheds will be run through funding from that. There's a variety of different funding sources for how people are creating PTMApp data throughout the state, but I'd say most of it is directly from that Clean Water Fund that's available from that Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment that's specific to Minnesota, I guess.
Just drilling in on the who then pushes the buttons, it's a range of players. I would say there's about a half a dozen or so in the state that have developed proficiencies in running this. The majority of users are using the output data, not actually running the tool. The state itself has not run many watersheds. They're typically more the stewards of the data once it's produced.
So the different entities are running the tool, but then they're submitting that data and the state is hosting it. Okay. Where is so the runs that have been done in Hawaii so far, are those hosted anywhere, or is that just on someone's local computer, or where is that data housed?
Yeah, right now they're sitting with me and ORCD. So our next step is to develop the kind of the web app, which would make it the accessibility. Yeah.
Thanks.
So we have about 5 minutes left. But yeah, I just wanted to give anyone else a chance who hasn't had anything to say to chime in. If not, you can always reach out via email. And we will circulate the recording and also the slides to everyone who's attended, and also the other people who are on our list. And we will keep you posted about our plans for the web app mockup. But yeah, I mean, I think just to let you all know, we are looking into other opportunities, looking at grants to help fund future work for this. But at the same time, we recognize that it's probably more useful to expand our partnerships. I do think that the DOH is probably a natural fit for this. But we also welcome other stakeholders that might be interested in partnering up. Any last thoughts before we close? All right, then if there's nothing else, I'm going to stop recording right now. And